Satanism. Always portrayed as a group of hooded individuals standing around a pentagram drawn in blood, while they sacrifice a small animal or child to their savior, the Prince of Hell. Though this idea is not entirely unfounded, the vast majority of Satanists never partake in any rituals, let alone any blood rituals. From the Salem Witch Trials to the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s, devil worshippers have always struck fear in the hearts of the public, especially a public composed of God-fearing Christians, despite rarely being the cause of harm to anyone. So join me today as we take a look at the history, denominations, and public hatred of the most misunderstood religion, Satanism. But before getting into the video, I should preface I am not a theologian and simply conveying to you research I did online. If I get something wrong, please tell me. And we will also be getting into some heavy topics today, so viewer discretion is advised. Also, I'm just going to apologize from the start. I'm sure I messed up the pronunciation of like 20 different names in here. If I did, please correct me in the comments, and I apologize again. The first depiction of an Antichrist figure like the one we all know and love didn't actually come from Christianity and its cloven-footed villain. It began in Zoroastrianism and their villainous figure called Angramanyu, or Ahriman, meaning destructive spirit or frightful spirit. Ahriman was brother to their godhead and creator of all things good, Ahura Mazda, and, out of spiteful jealousy, sent demons in order to spoil his brother's creation, only to be cast back to the darkness by his brother. Though not one-to-one, similarities between this story and that of Lucifer and his fight with the Christian God are easy to note, especially when looking at John Milton's Paradise Lost, detailing Lucifer's attempted overthrow of heaven, construction of pandemonium in hell, and temptation of Adam and Eve, / destruction of God's creation. Later, in Jewish Kabbalism, a Jewish tradition focused primarily on mysticism, another depiction of Satan came, showing him as a demon called Samael, or the Great Demon, living in a demonic realm known as Sitra Achra, meaning the other side. His companion is the demon Lilith, a figure also represented in pre-Kabbalistic denominations of Judaism as Adam's first rebellious wife. In Kabbalism, the demonic is shown as a realm separate from and opposing their god, going so far as to ascribe its origins as an association of God with femininity and judgment, rather than masculinity and grace as he is traditionally depicted, meaning that evil, in the Jewish Kabbalist sense, comes from a surplus of judgment. Many of the ideas present here would be later expressed in Jewish folk beliefs and Hasidic Judaism. Hasidic tales often contain expressions of the demonic, with one story of Hasidic Judaism's founder, Baal Shem Tov, defending a group of children from a werewolf attack. Even in modern times, some Hasidic Jews often protect themselves from demonic forces through use of things such as amulets and incantations, and sources going as far back as biblical times contain formulas for exorcisms to free one from an evil spirit known as a Dybbuk. Satan's first appearance in the Bible is the creation story as the serpent in Eden. However, the serpent is never denoted as Satan or the devil in the creation story, only going as the serpent. It was the apocryphal Book of Wisdom that included the first mention of the snake in Eden as the devil, and after that, the revelation of John. The term Satan was first used in the Book of Numbers, the fourth book of the Christian Bible, translated from Hebrew to describe defiance or an adversary. He is a recurring character in the Bible, with two major stories featuring him being the Book of Job, where he asks God to prove that his creation is faithful to him by testing his most faithful, a man named Job. After a series of tribulations faced and triumphed by Job, Satan leaves defeated. Another notable story featuring Satan is when he tempted Jesus in the book of Matthew. While Jesus was wandering in the desert for 40 days fasting, sin came to him and tried to convince him to end his hunger by turning stones into bread, throwing himself from a temple, and submitting to Satan in exchange for power. In response to all of these, Jesus quotes scripture and Satan again leaves defeated. In the book of Revelation, he is said to be the penultimate evil and a total opposition to Jesus, God, and holiness. This image of Satan is the one worshipped by reactive / adolescent Satanists and used as a symbol by other denominations. However, while Lucifer being cast out of heaven is mentioned in Isaiah 14:12, Satan's existence in the real world seems to be more of a shift made by the church to make God seem less oppressive and tyrannical and more as the caring father figure they portray him as. To quote an article from the University of Iowa titled, "Is the Snake in the Garden of Eden Satan?" quote, "An important glimpse into how Satan takes a more adversarial role and becomes responsible for evil acts once ascribed to God after the exile can be found by comparing 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21. In 2 Samuel 24, it is the Lord who gets upset at David, convinces him to take a census of the people, and then sends an angel to punish the people and nearly destroy Jerusalem because of David's sin of conducting a census. However, when 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1 begins its retelling of the same incident, it ascribes the blame to the accuser, who convinces David to take the census, which makes the extreme punishment much easier to understand." End quote. Though this is only one occasion, it is much more noticeable when comparing God across the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. In the Old Testament, God is much more fallible and angry, taking violent retribution against people that disobey him. One incident taking place during the times of Abraham is the case of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis, God destroys the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their wickedness, Genesis 19:24. Though this wickedness is never defined, and it's traditionally believed to either be homosexuality or inhospitality, both irrational things to destroy a town over. He also turns Abraham's nephew's wife into a pillar of salt for looking at the towns be destroyed. Anyway, another incident takes place during Moses' life when God forbids Moses from entering the Promised Land because he hit a rock instead of asking it to give him water. However, in the New Testament, where Satan is portrayed as a much more present figure, God is much more of the caring father figure he is always considered to be by the church. During Jesus' lifetime, people committed atrocities incomparable to what Sodom and Gomorrah or Moses did, and the only time any level of punishment was given to the perpetrators of these actions by Jesus was when they used the temple as a market instead of its intended purpose, that being to praise God. I say all of this to illustrate the introduction of Satan into the Christian canon, and how he seems like he was created as more of a way to blame the bad things in the world on some other force, while leaving God with supreme authority. Interestingly, Satan and the fear of a figure opposing Jesus was minimal during the Middle Ages of Europe, or the 5th century to the 15th century. Satan was actually usually used as a comedic relief in mystery plays, and it was only later, with the resurgence of religion, that fear of Satan became so high. In the 17th century, Romantics began to see Satan as less of a purely evil villain and more of an anti-hero. Paradise Lost, the poem I've referenced throughout this video, was a major player in this idea, as it made Satan a more sympathetic character, telling everything from his perspective and explaining his thoughts and beliefs. While it seems like Satan was only being portrayed positively during this time period, however, that couldn't be further from the truth. During the late 17th century, specifically 1692 to 1693, the infamous Salem Witch Trials were taking place in colonial Massachusetts. During this time, many members of the town of Salem were accused of being witches, practicing black magic, and being in league with the devil. This ended with over 200 accusations, 30 convictions, and at least 19 executions by hanging. Though all evidence showing that these people truly were witches has been completely dispelled, it shows to illustrate truly how hated and feared Satan, and by extension Satan worshippers, were at the time. In the 18th century, a pivotal text in the idea of Satan and his ideals as a positive came in William Godwin's An Equerry Concerning Political Justice, published in 1793. The text explained Godwin's political ideology and was one of the earliest texts to justify anarchism, and by extension Satan and his ideals of hedonism and placing more emphasis on the self than on others. Also taking place during the 18th century was the beginning of the Enlightenment period, Enlightenment being the idea that, rather than use tradition and religion to make choices, logic and reason should take the forefront of decision-making. Though not promoting Satan by any means, this minor shift from religion would undoubtedly lead to greater dissent towards traditional beliefs. In the 19th century, a revitalization of Satan's portrayal as an anti-hero emerged, thanks in no small part to Giosuè Cardacci's 1865 poem opposing the Catholic Pope, Hymn to Satan. It celebrated Satan as the symbol of freedom, progress, and reason, creating an image of Satan as a good in the world. Other works presenting Satan in a more positive light include William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, that praised him as the Messiah, and Madame Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, the first text to give religious credence to Satan's ideals, rather than political or social. It argued that Satan, as the snake in the Garden of Eden, convinced Eve and eventually Adam to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and provided humanity with knowledge it otherwise couldn't have dreamed of having. This, she argues, makes him, quote, the spirit of intellectual enlightenment and freedom of thought, end quote, or, in other words, a free thinker fighting the conformity of an oppressive power similar to opinions shared by groups critical of modern governments. Decadent artists, such as Felician Rops, would often incorporate satanic imagery into their art, drawing influences from popular Gothic writers like Edgar Allan Poe, known for The Raven and The Telltale Heart, as well as Charles Baudelaire, known for his collection of poems Flowers of Evil, which included litanies of Satan, portraying him as he was in The Secret Doctrine and other poems of the time. Satan's ideologies were even mentioned in socialist works like Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto, one of the most controversial and influential texts ever published. It was on Saturday nights and revivalist meetings on Sunday mornings. He would often see the same people at these two events, giving him a cynical view of religion, namely Christianity, and cause him to notice the hypocrisy in it. Following his work in the circus, LaVey would often play the organ at LA burlesque houses, where he allegedly had an affair with the then unknown Marilyn Monroe. LaVey claimed she was a dancer at the Mayan Theater, though the validity of this is contested. During the Korean War, he became a criminology major at the San Francisco City College to avoid the draft. In 1951, he interacted with some of the Berkeley Thelemites, the followers of Aleister Crowley, after reading some of Crowley's works, though he didn't feel that they were as, quote, wicked enough as propagators of his ideals. During this time, he met his first wife, Carol Lansing, with whom he had his first daughter, Carla Maritza LaVey, in 1952. While all of this was happening, LaVey was making extra money by taking, quote, nut calls as a, quote, psychic investigator. Though the happenings always had reasonable explanations, he began creating supernatural explanations for the events after seeing the way people reacted to the rational justifications. This also taught LaVey about the way belief played such a major role in many people's lives, giving him information for when his own religion would be launched. In 1956, he bought a large Victorian house that he painted black. It would end up serving as the house of the Church of Satan from 1966, the year of the church's creation, until October 17, 2001, when it was demolished. In 1959, LaVey met a woman named Diane Hegarty, and in 1960 he divorced his wife Carol for her. Diane had his second daughter, Zena Galati LaVey, in 1964, though the two would later separate in 1984, and Hegarty would sue LaVey for palimony. Shortly after splitting from Hegarty, LaVey would meet Blanche Barton, who had his final child, a son he named Satan Xerxes Karnacki LaVey. Because of his mix of jobs, namely the organ playing and psychic investigations, LaVey became a well-known figure locally, with his parties attracting a lot of notable people in San Francisco. These figures included Chester A. Arthur III, grandson of the 21st president, author Fritz Leiber, and Dr. Cecil E. Nixon, the creator of the ISIS musical automaton. Within the group of notables, LaVey created a group of friends sharing his interest in the weirder parts of the world that he called his magic circle. He continued to study things of this nature and gave lectures about his research on Friday nights. In 1965, LaVey was featured on The Brother Buzz Show, which focused on his lifestyle as a hypnotist, psychic investigator, and organist, while also showing his pet Nubian lion to go. Through his research, LaVey created his own philosophy of life. However, it was the mention of creating his own religion by a member of his magic circle that led him to found the Church of Satan on May Eve, the traditional Witches' Sabbath, of 1966, where he renamed the year 1 as the beginning of the Age of Satan. As one could imagine, the media attention was quite immediate and was driven heavily by the marriage of two high-profile people, journalist John Raymond and socialite Judith Case, at LaVey's house, the headquarters for the Church of Satan. With this attention, LaVey began spreading the message of the church, namely through the release of a record album titled The Satanic Mass. The cover featured the first use of the now iconic symbol of the sigil of Baphomet, the goat head and the pentagram with Leviathan written in the circle. The album had the rite of baptism of his 3-year-old daughter Zena, as well as LaVey reading pieces of his then unpublished Satanic Bible, while classical music played in the background. Through all of this, he gave his Friday lectures and created witches' workshops to help women attain things like beauty and discovering and exploiting male fetishes. Say what you will about LaVey, he was undeniably a jack of all trades. In 1969, LaVey finally completed his Satanic Bible after combining his own personal philosophy with that of Ayn Rand's, Nietzsche's, Mencken's, and London's, as well as the knowledge of the carnival peoples. The Satanic Bible was prefaced by... Through his actions with the church, LaVey interacted with many famous people, including singer Marilyn Manson, actress Jane Mansfield, and Susan Atkins, notable for being a member of the Manson. After writing the Satanic Bible, LaVey wrote The Complete Witch, which was later reprinted as The Satanic Witch, and discussed manipulating people to achieve one's own ends. Following The Complete Witch, The Satanic Rituals was published as a companion to the Satanic Bible, full of rituals from satanic tradition identified by LaVey in various cultures around the world. To be quite honest, I'm not too sure what that means. I I guess LaVey gave them the sniff test or something to decide if they were satanic. Anyone with information, please comment or let me know. Following the satanic rituals, LaVey also wrote 2 essay collections, one published during his lifetime and the other posthumously, those being The Devil's Notebook, published in 1992, and Satan Speaks, published in 1998, shortly after his passing on October 29, 1997. Following his death, Blanche Barton took up leadership of the church and passed it on to Peter H. Gilmore in 2001. As I mentioned in the beginning of this section, the impact LaVey had on the entire religion of Satanism is widespread. From his use of the sigil of Baphomet to the philosophies of more modern denominations of Satanism, to pop culture surrounding the founding of the Church of Satan. Books like Rosemary's Baby, its film adaptation, and other devil cult films from the time are undeniably influenced on some level by the publicity of the Church of Satanism, the Church of Satan gained shortly after its creation. As to what I feel to be a fitting conclusion to the life of such a fascinating and important character, I'd like to quote the Church of Satan's website of what it has to say about LaVey's impact. Quote, LaVey pursued a course that exposed him to the heights and depths of humanity, full of encounters with fascinating people. It climaxed with his founding of the Church of Satan and led to notorious celebrity on a worldwide scale. The Church has survived his death and continues, through the medium of his writings, to continually attract new members who see themselves reflected in the philosophy he called Satanism. End quote. There are numerous denominations of Satanism, and though most are pretty similar, some differ drastically from one to the other. However, there are many philosophies that remain constant across almost all denominations of the religion. The 3 major characteristics extending across all branches are as follows. 1. An interest in magic. Almost all denominations of Satanism incorporate mysticism, rituals, and spells in some way, showing the roots of much of Satanism shares with mysticism-based religion Wicca, though none perform any that bring harm to others. In fact, as will be discussed later, one of the major rules of LaVeyan Satanism is to not harm little children, which undermines a lot of fear during the Satanic Panic. The most common ritual taken part of by major denominations of Satanism is called the Black Mass, where various symbols of major religions are desecrated, though all sources I've found about it talked about it as it was a way to prove their non-conformity, not to denounce holiness or morality. 2. The creation of a community living in accordance with a set of tenets. This one is very simple to understand, as it is seen across almost all religions. Christianity has its 10 commandments, Islam has its 5 pillars, and Satanism has its tenets, usually exclusive to the denomination. As I mentioned above, LaVeyan Satanism has 11 tenets that they follow pretty strictly. And 3, the final one, is nonconformity. As discussed in the history section of this video, nonconformity, especially in the face of an oppressive power, is extremely important. If Satan's portrayal as an anti-hero, simply providing an abused creation with knowledge its creator would never have given it, hadn't made apparent. Known as the Church of Satan, this modern denomination of Satanism comes from the writings and teachings of Anton LaVey, namely his Satanic Bible. The book is based on ideas from many notable philosophers such as Ayn Rand, Friedrich Nietzsche, and H. L. Mencken, and is one of the most readily available texts on the teachings and philosophies of Satanism. Mainly following the major principles regarding all of Satanism with their beliefs in mysticism and obtaining your ends through supernatural means as well as nonconformity, their major tenets can be found in the 9 Satanic Statements, 11 Satanic Rules of the Earth, and the 9 Satanic Sins, which are as follows. The 9 Satanic Statements are as follows. 1. Satan represents indulgence instead of abstinence. 2. Satan represents vital existence instead of spiritual pipe dreams. 3. Satan represents undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit. 4. Satan represents kindness to those who deserve it instead of love wasted on ingrates. 5. Satan represents vengeance instead of turning the other cheek. 6. Satan represents responsibility for the responsible instead of concern for psychic vampires. Not sure what that means. 7. Satan represents man as just another animal, sometimes better, more often than worse than those that walk on all fours, who, because of his divine, spiritual, and intellectual development, has become most vicious of them all. 8. Satan represents all of the so-called sins as they lead to physical, mental, or emotional gratification. And 9. Satan has been the best friend the church has ever had, as he has kept it in business all these years. The 11 Satanic Rules of the Earth are: 1. Do not give advice or opinions unless you are asked. 2. Do not tell your troubles to others unless you are certain they want to hear them. 3. When in another's lair, show him respect, or else do not go there. 4. If a guest in your lair annoys you, treat him cruelly and without mercy. 5. Do not make sexual advances unless they are giving the mating signal. 6. Do not take what does not belong to you unless it is a burden to the other person and he cries out to be relieved. 7. Acknowledge the power of magic if you have employed it successfully to obtain your desires. If you deny the power of magic after calling upon it with success, you will lose all you have obtained. 8. Do not complain about anything to which you need not subject yourself. 9. Do not harm little children. 10. Do not kill non-human animals unless you are attacked or it is for food. And 11. When walking in open territory, bother no one. If someone bothers you, ask him to stop. If he does not stop, destroy him. The 9 satanic sins are 1. Stupidity, 2. Pretentiousness, 3. Solipsism, 4. Self-deceit, 5. Herd conformity, 6. Lack of perspective, 7. Forgetfulness of past orthodoxies, 8. Counterproductive pride, and 9. Lack of aesthetics. The church began in 1966 with LaVey and his Circle of Nine, a group from his magic circle of friends all sharing interest in the more macabre side of the world. Being present in San Francisco at the time of the church's inception, there were many others interested in occultism, and, along with the media attention gained by the eye-catching name, theatrical performances, and ideals of hedonism and magic, the church grew quickly. This was the church's heyday, lasting from its creation in 1966 through about 1975, where it was a media sensation both domestically and internationally. In 1975, however, growth slowed and eventually stopped, spurred on by the creation of other denominations of Satanism, constantly creating new systems of belief and religious movements all centered around the Satanic. One big denomination at the time was the Temple of Set, a theistic/esoteric denomination of Satanism, while others like Luciferianism also became major players in the Satanic scene. And of course, starting in the 80s with roots planted in the 70s, the Satanic Panic made participation in anything labeled as satanic a prison sentence. Thankfully, the church survived this and remains a group, though, interestingly, they never pursued the tax exemption status and are not recognized as a legal religion by the government. As mentioned in the biography section on LaVey, leadership of the church passed to his wife, Blanche Barton, following his death. Recently, however, she passed leadership to Peter H. Gilmore. Unfortunately, the church has stagnated in both growth and action since the 60s, something critics of the church will often point out. However, they never were a very public group. They started as a group of friends LaVey had and grew to hold entire gatherings with amazing theatrical performances and a vast system of beliefs. It might not seem too interesting compared to more public and action-focused groups like the Satanic Temple, but the church is arguably the most important denomination of Satanism because now we've gotten to the most famous denomination of Satanism, and the most prominent as well, with over 700,000 members worldwide, including myself. Though not known as a specific denomination other than modern Satanism, the Satanic Temple is the most prevalent and growing denomination of Satanism in the modern era. Another non-theistic denomination of Satanism, and often confused with the aforementioned Church of Satan, the Temple has many differences from its older counterpart. While some minor disagreements of ideology are present, such as a lack of magic or a different literary canon, the biggest difference between them and the Church of Satan is that the Satanic Temple does not believe that people who like blue cheese are more inclined to be homosexual than those who don't, unlike the Church. No, I'm not kidding. In all seriousness, though, the Satanic Temple is vastly different from the Church of Satan, and luckily for us, the Temple has been kind enough to make a chart to compare and contrast the two. Some major differences between the Satanic Temple and the Church of Satan are that the Satanic Temple has a large array of books in its ideology, while the Church is based primarily on LaVey's teachings. Furthermore, the Temple does not believe in magic, and the Temple has physical chapters, while the Church of Satan doesn't have any brick-and-mortar facilities. The Temple is much less theological than the Church of Satan, as they don't hold any belief in magic and exist almost exclusively as upholders of the First Amendment, though they do have a vast literary canon. This includes Litanies of Satan by Charles Baudelaire, Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, and a vast library of histories about Satanism. The Satanic Temple was founded in January of 2013 by Lucian Greaves, the spokesperson for the Satanic Temple, and Malcolm Jerry. In an interview, Greaves said the idea of starting the temple was first created to meet, quote, all the Bush administration's criteria for receiving funds, but was repugnant to them being the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, end quote. meaning that they wanted to make a joke religion that was completely legal and had to be recognized by the Christian president. According to Joseph Laylock, Malcolm intended to praise the governor of Florida at the time, Rick Scott, for passing a law circumventing the Supreme Court's ruling against mandatory prayer in school. This was done by allowing students to read inspirational religious quotes during school events, and by extension, allowing children to praise Satan in school by dressing a group of people up as Satan and holding a rally. Following this, the Westboro Baptist Church, a homophobic hate group based in Kansas, traveled to Boston, the hometowns of Greaves and Jerry, to picket funerals of victims of the Boston Marathon bombing, in order to spread the message that America was doomed due to its acceptance of the LGBTQ+ community. In retaliation to this, Greaves, Jerry, and the rest of the small following they had garnered by then traveled to Missouri to have a pink mass at the grave of the mother of the leader and founder of the Westboro Baptists. This pink mass, a ritual admitted to be made up by the founders of the temple, consisted of same-sex couples making out over the grave and announcing that the founder's mother was now gay in the afterlife. Baller move. This gave the temple the media attention that kicked off its rise in popularity. Sadly, there was a major schism in 2018 after disagreement arose regarding diversity on the National Council. Since, there have been many chapters to split from the temple due to differing philosophies. However, for the purposes of this video, we will only be covering the ideas and actions of the main temple. Despite existing for more than 6 years at this time, the temple didn't gain the status of tax exemption until April 25th of 2019. Prior, they had avoided gaining the tax exemption status. However, the passing of the Johnson Amendment by then-President Trump caused them to push for it, as they felt it favored religious individuals. And of course, throughout their entire existence, they have been promoting the temple and freedom of religion through many public actions, which we will discuss later. Similar to the Church of Satan, the Satanic Temple has 7 fundamental tenets that they follow. However, they are much less spiritual than the Church of Satan's. Number 1. One should strive to act with compassion and empathy in accordance with reason. 2. The struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. 3. One's own body is infallible, subject to one's own will alone. 4. The freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forgo one's own. 5. Beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. One should take care to never distort scientific facts to fit one's beliefs. 6. People are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do the best to rectify it and resolve any harm that it may have caused. 7. Every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should always prevail over the written or spoken word. The Satanic Temple has held many events and congregations since its creation, the most prominent being the following. SatanCon, held in Arizona in 2022 and Boston in 2023. It was cancelled in 2024 because they were putting time and energy towards upholding social justice. This convention has been held for the temple to congregate. Outside of SatanCon in 2022, masses of Christians protested the convention with crosses in hand, and following the event in 2023, the Archdiocese of Boston, a Latin church based in Boston, responded to the event with, quote, intense prayer. Black Mass. As mentioned earlier, the Black Mass is a parody of the traditional Catholic Mass, during which various religious symbols are desecrated in order to renounce the religions, namely Christianity, that dominate our society. As mentioned at the end of the history section, the Satanic Temple has performed many actions in the public eye to promote the upholding of the First Amendment. Some major ones include the following. Statues at state capitals. In both Arkansas and Oklahoma, the Satanic Temple has put up large statues of Baphomet at the state capitol after both states had the Ten Commandments put in the state capitol as well. Funnily enough, within 24 hours of the Ten Commandments monument being erected in Arkansas, it was run over and destroyed by a man filming on his cell phone. The man claimed to have been told by Satan to destroy the monument, however was not affiliated with the temple. The Baphometic Bowl of Wisdom. This was a statue approved to be erected at a park in Minnesota in honor of fallen soldiers after a statue of a soldier kneeling in front of a cross was put in the park. As is usual, the Christian groups opposed the statue for its imagery, and the city retracted the Satanic Temple's permission to put up the statue. However, the statue of the soldier in front of the cross was removed as well. Interestingly, the Baphometic Bowl of Wisdom was constructed and now rests in the Satanic Temple's Salem branch. Bladensburg Satanic Peace Cross. In 1925, a 40-foot tall cross was erected in Bladensburg, Maryland in honor of World War I veterans. Acquired in 1961 by Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, the cross now stands on public property and is maintained by public funds. A Supreme Court case arose in 2019 stating that the cross violated the First Amendment. When it was found that it did not in fact violate the First Amendment because it honored all veterans, the Satanic Temple took it upon themselves to update the status of the cross, making a pilgrimage to Maryland to hold a ceremony, desanctifying the monument and renaming it the Bladensburg Satanic Peace Cross, making Bladensburg, Maryland the first place to have a satanic monument on public property. Unsurprisingly, the primary religion of people in the education system is Christian, and because they are the ones responsible for the most impressionable minds in our society, it is unsurprising that the Satanic Temple has taken many actions against the education system in the name of religious freedom. Here's a quick list and summary of the major ones. The Satanic Children's Big Book of Activities. This activity booklet was distributed in response to a slew of religious pamphlets being passed out in schools. Copies can also be purchased on the Satanic Temple's website, and looking through it, there's a wide variety of wholesome activities for children in there, just having a satanic theme. After School Satan Club. The After School Satan Club is an after-school program teaching children social skills and reasoning, made to counter good news clubs from Christian churches for children to go to and hear the Word of God after school. The After School Satan Clubs allow children to find a place to meet other children and learn skills for the rest of their lives without worrying about religious discrimination from the people teaching them. Protect Children Project. In line with their third satanic tenet, this project is made to protect children from corporal punishment, restriction of bathroom access, and use of physical restraints in school from school officials that are deemed illegal. By asserting a religious claim that you are a part of the Satanic Temple will press charges for violating a child's religious beliefs, namely that of bodily autonomy. Reproductive autonomy. Similar to the school campaigns and their beliefs in bodily autonomy, the Satanic Temple has taken part in many protests and campaigns in favor of abortion and personal choice when it comes to parenthood, even humorously selling get-out-of-pregnancy-free cards on the site. Some protests they have taken part in are as follows. Abortion medical services as a religious ritual. One of their biggest victories, the Satanic Temple has set up various abortion clinics in states such as Virginia and New Mexico, and is fighting for the ability to set them up in more restrictive states such as Indiana and Idaho, all under the claim that the performances of the abortion are a religious ritual and therefore legal. Ferndale pro-abortion protest. Satirizing an anti-abortion protest made by Planned Parenthood groups at the same time, the Detroit chapter of the Satanic Temple held a guerrilla theater performance that included women in binds having milk poured on them. The reason for this performance given by the church was to, quote, expose the anti-choice protest as an act of fetal idolatry, highlighting the fetishization and abstraction of the baby, end quote. Of course, the Satanic Temple's primary goal is to promote religious freedom for all, not just the Christians who dominate all aspects of American life, so I couldn't get every protest they've held for such freedoms. However, I would want to encourage everyone who is interested to do their own research, as there is a vast array of things the Satanic Temple has done for people's religious freedoms. Now we are on to the branch of Satanism that gives the rest of us a bad name. Reactive Satanism is the branch of Satanism where the stereotypical idea of a person sacrificing a child to the devil comes from. Luckily, however, the beliefs of reactive Satanism are very simple to understand, as it is all an inversion of the beliefs of Christians, meaning that they both believe in and recognize the Christian God and Satan. However, rather than venerating and praising God, they do so to Satan. Reactive Satanism became semi-popular in the 1980s in response to the massive Christian propagation of the 1970s. During the 70s, things like the Billy Graham Crusades, which were sermons given on TV by the evangelist Billy Graham, the Christianity Today magazine, also started by Graham, and the influence of Francis Schaeffer, an evangelical philosopher, were very popular. All that is to say, Christianity was the most prominent religion in society during the 70s going into the 80s, and as adolescents are common to do, went against it. This is where the name adolescent Satanism comes from. As for the other name, reactive Satanism is a denomination made in reaction to society and the primary evangelical religious movements of the time. According to the Cambridge Companion on New Religious Movements, Chapter 13, Satanism, written by Jesper Aagaard and Asbjorn Dyrendal, reactive Satanism is, quote, dependent upon and thus paradigmatically conforms to the context of which it is a part, end quote. This means that it acts as sort of a gold standard for stereotypical Satanism, though the belief system is rather niche in the wider religion of Satanism itself. However, despite the image that the denomination holds as true devil worshippers, there is nothing necessarily linking it to criminal behavior on any level, whether it be petty or violent, contrary to how the media portrays it. Groups of reactive Satanists and their ideologies and doctrines are difficult to pin down, as the religion was created by and partaken of by, with all due respect, moody teenagers going against the cultural norm they were surrounded by. Reactive Satanism is more of a cultural phenomenon than anything else, far from a church system or system of beliefs, because to partake in reactive Satanism is to acknowledge the Christian Satan as existing, and to acknowledge the Christian God as existing. By extension, they denounce the good God is intended to represent, and because of this, make reactive Satanists' ultimate goal to reach the Christian hell, going against any idea of human self-preservation. Some prominent reactive Satanists are Colombian serial killer Luis Garavito, American serial killer Richard Ramirez, and Gorillaz bassist Murdoch Nichols. Similar to reactive Satanism, Luciferianism is a system of beliefs rather than a religion, so there won't be a section of history or public actions. Believers praise the character traits Lucifer has been given in many works of literature, most of which were listed in the modern history section of the video. Despite this veneration of Lucifer, Luciferians don't worship Satan or Lucifer, Satan being the fallen version of Lucifer. Instead, they model themselves off of Lucifer as he was portrayed in the 17th century onwards, a liberator, anti-hero, and champion of freedom. The Luciferian doctrine is actually really interesting in it that it accepts all use of violence as long as it is warranted, while not focusing on getting more people to share the Luciferian way of life or beliefs. A list of major ideals propagated by the group Order of the Luciferian Sword include being free to act with an acknowledgement of consequences, pursuing wealth and prosperity, accepting carnal nature, i.e. accepting the pleasures of the flesh, similar to Church of Satan's ideas of hedonism. Cruelty has its place when warranted, supporting and cherishing the natural world. Art and science are to be valued equally, focusing on the present and achieving enlightenment is the end goal. The moral panic of the late 80s and early 90s was truly massive, spreading across the entire country and uniting all Christians in fear of Satan, the devil, or Lucifer, and his hold on the moral fabric of society. Though these threats were almost entirely imagined and founded only on extremely sensationalized newspaper articles, the impact it had on America is impossible to overstate. Ruining lives and bringing hundreds of prosecutions and convictions against entirely innocent people for truly heinous crimes, and defining the culture of the time, the impact of the Satanic Panic is one that can be felt even today. Following the beginning of American involvement in Vietnam in 1965, the counterculture hippie movement became a major part of the culture of America, criticizing consumerism and the American dream that had dominated social ideologies of decades prior. These ideas of anti-consumerism ushered in the Beat Generation, with some of the most celebrated poets and authors of all time, including Allen Ginsberg, author of Howl, and Jack Kerouac, author of On the Road. San Francisco became a massive center for people sharing hippie ideas of peace and love, as well as the birthplace of the Church of Satan in 1966. However, not all hippies were so peaceful, and the infamous Tate LaBianca murders, perpetrated by the even more infamous Manson family, remained in the public consciousness for years after. They took place in 1969 and were a major catalyst for the beginning of the Satanic Panic. The 70s continued these anti-materialist, peaceful ideologies, the hippie movement remaining in the public zeitgeist for much of the 70s. However, the 70s also mark an important time in popular culture, as restrictions on violence and obscenity in content were loosened, allowing for the rise of genres like horror. This allowed films like Jaws and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to garner much critical acclaim and remain some of the most celebrated films in the horror genre, while heavy metal and bands such as Metallica, Black Sabbath, and AC/DC dominated the music scene. However, in a culture dominated by religious revivals from characters like Billy Graham, the fields were ripe with things for Christians to take issue with. Many from old generations were able to see their grip on society loosen, and, as with any change, they didn't want to accept it. So they searched for issues in it and were able to find some quickly. As mentioned, the restrictions in the entertainment industry were loosened, and films were using religious iconography in sacrilegious ways, films like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist being major examples. These two films of the late 60s and early 70s concerning the corruption of an innocent through a religiously antagonistic character, which paired with the religious and specifically satanic imagery in many bands of the time, examples being songs like Highway to Hell by AC/DC, and bands such as Black Sabbath or Lucifer's Friend, led many to fear that the devil himself had taken hold of the minds of the youth and that something had to be done about it. Something important to understand is that people's fear of the devil didn't simply come from the iconography and the culture of the time, and instead on quote-unquote fact. I say fact because those facts were just highly sensationalized headlines from the time, including the aforementioned Manson family murders, the book Michelle Remembers, the McMartin preschool trial, a case we will get into later, and the killings and eventual capture of Richard Ramirez, otherwise known as the Night Stalker. The panic took hold nationwide in the mid-1980s, though specific dates of when it began and ended can't be officially identified. The most major events sowing the seeds of the panic began closest to its beginning and will be the ones we cover first. Jack Chick is a very far-right Christian cartoonist who made and handed out a large series of Chick tracts, 24-page cartoons intended to spread the good word of Christ. The thing is, Jack Chick was a very far-right Christian who also held the opinions many in the 70s and 80s did. This resulted in many tracts existing as warnings against entirely harmless pieces of media, such as D&D or Harry Potter, or being horribly homophobic or racist. Jack was born April 13, 1924, to Thomas and Pauline Chick, parents who Jack claims didn't show him much love, instead giving it to his sister Doris. However, he did find a quote-unquote escape from this in drawing, so much so that he failed first grade because he spent so much time drawing. He was also a good actor and got a scholarship to the Pasadena Playhouse, a performing arts theater in Pasadena, California. However, after being drafted to the Army in 1943, he had to pause his acting career. As a soldier in World War II, Chick traveled around the world to places such as New Guinea and Japan, however he never saw combat, instead serving as a cryptographer decoding intercepted codes from the enemy. After he was discharged from the Army at the war's conclusion, he returned to Pasadena and acting. This is where he met his wife, Lola Priddle, and during their honeymoon, he converted to Christianity. This happened when Lola's mother asked that he sit and listen to Charles E. Fuller's old-fashioned revival hour radio program. In 1953, Jack got a job doing advertising art for Aerojet General Corporation and, after seeing all the hypocrisy of the church, made his first comic book, Why No Revival, using $800 borrowed from the credit union to publish it. Shortly after publishing Why No Revival, he saw a group of teenagers as he was driving home and, pulling off the road, wrote down the story for his first true Chick tract, A Demon's Nightmare. In need of money to publish the tract, Jack gave a copy of Why No Revival to his boss's secretary, knowing his boss was a Christian who, after reading it, called Jack into his office to tell him he wanted to help pay for his next printing. Hearing about the Chinese being convinced of communism through cartoons and propaganda, Chick believed his purpose in life was to convert others to Christianity through similar methods, and began making tracts as his full-time job. For the next half a century, Chick wrote and printed his tracts until he died on October 23, 2016, at 92 years old. However, his tracts are still passed around, with many people stating that they are what caused them to convert to Christianity. The thing is, they were incredibly offensive to a lot of groups, claiming that homosexuals were destined to burn in hell, and that the groups like Roman Catholics and Muslims were responsible for conspiracy and murder. However, they do certainly serve as a good reflection of the culture of the time. But why are we talking about it? Other than being a cartoonist intending to help spread the good word through messages that are today socially unacceptable to most people, the Baptist denomination does share his views on homosexuality, but not race, he doesn't seem too important. The reason is, he spread a lot of factually incorrect information on many satanic topics, as well as how the culture was negatively influencing children, and that adults were always happy to take advantage of children. These tracts fueled the fire of an already morally upset society and contributed to the anti-counterculture movement of the time. Published in 2004, this one serves less as a fueling of the flames of a morally panicking society, and rather as a reflection of the beliefs of those fearing the Satanic Panic, and how such beliefs are still present today. The first page opens with a girl named Buffy, no I'm not kidding, expressing distress at a Dracula decoration while her mother talks about her love for Halloween. The next scene shows us a girl named Susie wanting to avoid dressing up as a witch for the class Halloween party and instead dresses up as Santa to the lividity of her teacher. After this, she walks to the ice cream store and later home with Buffy, who educates her on the quote-unquote history of Halloween. Buffy tells us that pagans taught that Salem, the supposed god of death, called back all souls that were in animals, to which the people danced to drive away the spirits. While this happened, pagans went around asking for food as an offering for their gods. However, if the people they asked didn't have food, they took their pet or child and killed them, then put out a jack-o'-lantern. It was claimed that this was the origin of trick-or-treat, and that these animal/child sacrifices still happen. Susie also tells us that people celebrate Halloween to induct children into black magic, witchcraft, and devil worship. I'm pretty sure I don't need to tell you that this is not at all the origin of any of that. First of all, Salem, whose name means good-minded, is a Buddhist god who is considered the guardian deity of Sripada and Theravada Buddhism, not the god of death. Second, Halloween comes from a Celtic celebration called Samhain, which, though pagan, has nothing to do with human spirits and animals, and is instead celebrated to ward off ghosts, not invite them in. As for trick-or-treating, there are three theories of its origin. One is that, on Samhain, people would leave out food for the spirits traveling the earth. Another is that children in Germany would dress up and get food if no one could guess who they were, a practice called Belsnickeling. This name comes from their version of Santa Claus, Belschnickel, see Deutsch Christmas from The Office. The final theory is that during the Middle Ages, Scottish children and poor people would provide prayers for the dead on All Souls' Day, in return for candy, though the prayers were later changed to songs or jokes. Another thing is that the tract completely forgets the point of modern Halloween. There is nothing to do with witchcraft today, and almost all the Christians I know today agree. Dark Dungeons is a particularly famous tract among those who discuss them online for the reasons you'll soon see. And published in 1984, Dark Dungeons was written to teach us that much of popular media was corrupting the youth partaking in them. Also, please keep in mind while we go over this one that these were handed out to children. We open with a group of teenagers playing a game of Dungeons & Dragons with an older woman as the dungeon master. One of the people playing dies in the game and starts crying, and later the dungeon master takes one girl named Debbie, a cleric, aside to tell her that she's now able to use the quote, real power. We then cut to an occult gathering, and because I can't not read this, the panel says, quote, "The intense occult training through D&D prepared Debbie to accept the invitation to enter a witch's coven." End quote. After this, Debbie tells the dungeon master how happy she is with her witch powers. Later in the week, Debbie is called over to Marcy's, the girl who died in D&D earlier, to find that she hanged herself because she died in D&D. It's not funny because of what she did, it's funny that this is what they think will happen to people that play D&D, and that this is what they were teaching children. Debbie is later found crying by a boy named Mike who says that he understands what she's going through and that she should go to church with him, and later at church, Debbie is exorcised of the D&D demons that had possessed her. As I said before, these tracts were distributed to children in order to teach them about the dangers of playing Dungeons & Dragons, and reading discussions about them online, you'll find people talking about how this one specifically scarred them as children. Now, other than the obviously dark content children should not have been exposed to, this tract is one that led to the charge in saying that D&D was part of what was corrupting the children, and led to not a few witch hunts, get it, looking for children playing D&D to set them on the Published in 1980 and co-authored by Lawrence Pasder and Michelle Smith, Michelle Remembers tells the supposedly suppressed memories of Michelle Smith, who, after 600 hours of hypnosis therapy, recounted being given to a devil-worshipping cult by her mother at 5, and used to raise Satan himself. Naturally, this became popular immediately, quickly picked up by concerned Christians worrying for the safety of their own children, fueling the flames of the moral panic that was quickly spreading across America. Unfortunately, or fortunately I guess, none of anything that supposedly happened in Michelle Remembers ever happened. Lawrence Pastor, Michelle's therapist, swore vehemently that everything Michelle remembered was true. However, looking at the details gives one pause. For one thing, little evidence other than Michelle's memories was provided, save a couple images supposedly containing Satan in them. The thing is, the human mind is really good at seeing what it wants in images where it isn't, and it's a phenomenon called pareidolia, and it's the reason you see faces in trees or clothes or whatever. We have it because the human brain is wired to search for other humans, which is usually beneficial, how it allows people to see quote-unquote Satan in poor quality black and white photos. Other discrepancies include the claim of the abuse taking place in a town in Victoria, Canada in the 1950s, and that one of her abusers was missing a finger. However, no account exists of any member of that town missing a finger. Furthermore, Smith's family, namely her father, Jack Proby, in an interview deny the fact that she was abused, and there is no police report, despite the claims that police were called to the Proby household. Not only that, but during the 81 days Smith was supposedly captive, she attended school, with her elementary yearbook photo proving it. Also, for however important this is, filmmakers on the documentary Satan Wants You interviewed Lawrence Pastor's wife, who stated that Pastor's relationship with Smith led him to growing distant from his family and caused the pair's divorce. She also claimed that the events stated to have happened in the book couldn't have happened, and that the Catholic Church, which Pastor was a part of, promoted the book as factual in an effort to get people back to church. Plus, on top of all of that, Michelle was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder by Pastor. Interestingly, the Church of Satan actually brought a defamation suit against Pastor shortly following the publication of the book for including the phrase Church of Satan. Anton LaVey claimed that the book was, quote, defamatory, libelous, and had resulted in a loss of reputation, end quote, something I have to agree with since Pastor basically claimed that LaVey's church was nothing but child abusers. Blanche Barton said in 2023 that, quote, one of the things LaVey was particularly miffed about is how Michelle Remembers was marketed as a supposedly true story, but was so chock full of things which Satanism isn't, end quote. Pastor and his defense team provided many almost comedic rebuttals to LaVey's defamation claims, ranging from stating that Pastor had never heard of LaVey or the Church of Satan, even though he stated in the book that he was well researched on Satanism and the occult, to denying that LaVey could lose anything from the book because he was by his own admission a Satanist and a celebrity, and thus libel proof. To claiming that the events of the story weren't necessarily based. Quick preface here, I want it to be made very clear that I have no sympathy for Ramirez, and I think he deserved everything he got and more, regardless of his childhood experiences. I don't want my covering of him to be misunderstood as some sort of reference. I simply believe his actions and conviction are important to the context and events of this video. Otherwise known as the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez was convicted in 1989 of the murder of 13 people, attempted murder of 5 others, 11 SAs, and 14 burglaries. However, it is known that he killed at least 14 people. Born on February 29, 1960, Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born the 5th child of Mercedes and Julio Ramirez, both immigrants from Mexico. His father was an alcoholic who would often physically abuse his family, and Richard sustained multiple head injuries at a young age, reportedly becoming epileptic after being knocked unconscious by a swing at age 5. After this, at age 12, he became very close with his cousin Miguel, who, after returning from Vietnam, told Richard many stories of torturing women, and showed Richard images as proof. During this time, Richard began sleeping in a local cemetery in order to avoid his father's abuse, though this resulted in his father tying him to a crucifix as punishment. Shortly after this, and still an early adolescent I might add, Richard witnessed Miguel murder his wife, though Miguel was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Around the time of the murder, Richard dropped out of school and was arrested for the possession of marijuana, and after his release, moved to California where he became addicted to cocaine, as well as extremely interested in Satanism and the occult. He even supposedly met Anton LaVey going as far as to comment on his interaction with Ramirez, though the validity of this is uncertain. Here he was arrested twice, both for stealing a car, and it was around this time that he began to seriously neglect his personal hygiene. This fact would become important during investigation. His repeated behavior of semi-petty crime moved to violence when, in 1984, he stabbed and SA'd 79-year-old Jenny Vinco before burglarizing her house. Satanic imagery became Richard Ramirez's calling card to the police, often drawing a pentagram on or near his victims or asking them to, quote, swear to Satan. In August of 1985, he was finally captured by the police and convicted, where he continued his use of satanic imagery, raising a hand with a pentagram drawn on it and yelling "Hail Satan" at his first appearance. This, as well as his demeanor throughout the proceedings, led to many members of the jury growing afraid of Ramirez, something that was only increased when one of the members of the jury was found murdered midway through the trial. Ramirez had nothing to do with this murder, though it does serve to show just how terrifying he was. Finally, in 1989, he was convicted of the 13 murders, 11 SAs, 5 attempted murders, and 14 burglaries, and was sentenced to death in the gas chamber. His final words to the press were, quote, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland," end quote. He died in 2013 due to complications due to lymphoma. Obviously, these murders and the eventual trial and conviction of Ramirez caused even more widespread moral panic, reinforcing the beliefs that Satan-worshipping cults and people existed throughout society, who murdered women, children, and animals, and allowed charges to be pressed and convictions to be made towards people who never had or would hurt other individuals. Nicknamed the Acid King for the amount of LSD he would deal and consume, Ricky Kasso gained infamy after he stabbed another teenager, unintentionally adding fuel to the fire of the Satanic Panic because of his status as a devil worshipper and interest in popular metal bands. Ricky was born on March 26th of 1967 to Dick Kasso and Lynn Kasso. Dick was a big sports fan, reportedly waiting to take his wife who was in labor to the hospital until the game he was watching finished. Dick deservedly gets a lot of the blame for how Ricky turned out, not only because he pushed his love of sports onto his son to an unhealthy degree, often stopping games Ricky played in to publicly criticize his playing, but because of his tough love approach to parenting, specifically with Ricky. Still, Ricky seemed like a good kid until the 7th grade when he began his career as a thief. Kasso took money from his church's collection plate and shortly after broke into a house, however was caught by the police during the process. Upon finding out that these actions were to fuel a drug habit, his parents were furious, and he was subsequently enrolled into a drug rehabilitation program, though he would simply skip it, and after a psychiatric facility didn't work either, he broke out 5 times during his stay. He was kicked out of his house and began sleeping in friends' houses, or, more often, some woods referred to by the locals as Aztecia Woods, for the remains of a church that reminded them of Aztec ruins. This is the beginning of his lifestyle of selling drugs, going as far as the South Bronx, all to pay for his diet of bologna, white bread, and LSD. Kasso dropped out of school at the age of 16, however before he dropped out, he learned of what would become an obsession for him: Satanism and the occult. Kasso was often seen carrying around a copy of the Satanic Bible, going into Aztecia Woods to, quote, commune with Satan, rituals that primarily consisted of lighting a fire and chanting Satan over and over, and randomly yelling "Hail Satan." He would also vandalize the park near Aztecia Woods with satanic words and images, though he misspelled the word Satan as Satin. Despite his reputation as a drug addict, Satanist, and mentally ill, he did have friends who lived similar lives, namely Gary Lauwers, Jimmy Troiano, and Albert Quijones, as well as a Vietnam veteran called Pagan Pat by the local kids. Gary, the boy Kasso would later kill, and Ricky were friends since they were in the same class in 2nd grade. In 1983, Kasso was arrested for grave robbing a colonial-era grave, and less than a month later contracted pneumonia due to his life on the street, often without any warmth, and was hospitalized. During his stay, his parents tried to have him committed to involuntary psychiatric care, however he was deemed antisocial but not violent, and released after recovering from pneumonia. Of course, according to him, he simply, quote, BS'd the counselor who evaluated him, denying having suicidal thoughts or worshipping Satan. After this, he went back to the streets, doing and dealing drugs as usual, until one night while passed out, when Gary Lauwers stole 10 bags of angel dust from Kasso. Realizing as soon as he woke up that the dust had been taken, he was furious, and Lauwers immediately confessed, giving back 5 of the bags. However, having already done or given away the other 5 bags, he promised to pay Ricky back with $50. However, being a drug addict, this took a while. This resulted in common beratings and beatings from Kasso, mending the relationship between the boys. That all changed on June 19th of 1984. That night, Kasso, Quijones, and Troiano asked Lauwers and some other teens to go to Aztecia Woods to hang out and get high, persuading Lauwers with the promise of jelly donuts. After starting a fire at the expense of Lauer's socks and jacket sleeves, the group all got high, the four named boys taking 40 tabs of what they called microdots, though they were likely LSD, and 17 bags of PCP between them. The other teens later left, and the four were left alone. The events of the night aren't entirely known, however at some point Casso began assaulting Lauers, first with kicks and punches, and eventually stabbing him in the chest. Quijones claimed that Troyanos had held Lauers down, however later recanted his testimony. Of course, given Quijones' mental state at the time, the legitimacy of this isn't known. During the attack, Casso stabbed Lauers between 17 and 36 times, including in his eyes, all the while demanding that Lauers say he loved Satan, though Lauers is said to have replied with, quote, "I love my mother." Certain that he was dead, Casso and Troiano buried Lauers beneath some leaves and small branches. In the weeks following, Casso openly bragged about the murder to many teens, going as far as to show between 12 and 20 the body. He also claimed that following the murder, he saw a crow caw and that it was Satan expressing his approval for the murder. After showing the teens the body, he and Troiano buried it, his skull reportedly falling off during the process, much to Casso's amusement. Assuming that they'd never be caught now that he was buried, Casso and Troiano decided to hitchhike to California and start a new life, though feeling homesick, bought a cheap car and returned home. On July 2nd, a girl sent an anonymous tip to the police about Lauer's murder, Lauer's own parents having not pursued him due to how often he had run away, and his body was discovered on the 4th. On the 5th of July, Casso and Troiano were arrested, Casso getting arrested and escorted into prison wearing a borrowed AC/DC shirt. A few days later, amidst chants of fellow inmates encouraging him, Casso hung himself on the 7th. At this point, concerned parents already believed that the music was hurting the children, but the actions of Casso all but confirmed it. No one thought to consider that he had turned to drugs to escape the abuse at home, no one wanted to think about him getting kicked out at a young age, and no one thought about his clear mental illness. People always want a scapegoat, and nothing is easier to blame than a millennia-old villain. In the year since his death, Casso has been mentioned and portrayed in popular media in many forms. A book and documentary about his life titled The Acid King have been released, and Aesop Rock made a song about him titled Acid King. By far the most infamous case from this time period, the McMartin preschool trials display the quintessential traits of any case of satanic ritual abuse, starting with some absurd claims made by a mentally ill mother and ending with the most expensive trial in American history, a corrupt politician, and leading questions from social workers thrown in for good measure. The trials began in May of 1983 when Judy Johnson, mother of a 2.5-year-old boy who attended the school, called the police, stating that the school aide, Ray Bucky, had taken advantage of her child after she saw a spot of blood on her son's rectum. Johnson then met with Detective Jane Hoag of the Manhattan Beach Police to have Ray and the preschool investigated. Shortly after this, Johnson's son Billy was interviewed, and though reports are conflicting regarding whether or not he said he was taken advantage of, Ray Bucky was arrested. The thing is, Judy wasn't reliable at all. She was diagnosed and hospitalized as a paranoid schizophrenic and alcoholic, and as the trial went on, made increasingly absurd claims about the teachers at the school. For example, about a year after making the original statement of Billy being violated, she said in an interview with the police that her son was stapled in his tongue, nipples, and ears, attacked by a lion, and stabbed in his eyes with scissors by the cape-wearing preschool teachers who were witches. Additionally, in a separate interview about a week later, Judy claimed he was flown out of the LAX airport to Palm Springs, taken to an armory with a, quote, ritual-typical atmosphere, end quote, where a goat man was, all from the time that Billy was dropped off to picked up. Yes, this was taken seriously in court, and it all came out of taxpayers' money. Following the arrest, the Manhattan Beach Police Chief, Harry Kuhlmeyer, sent out a letter to over 200 parents of children that attended the McMartin preschool, informing them of the situation with Bucky and encouraging them to ask their children if anything weird had happened to them at school, mentioning any activity under the guise of a temperature check or the like. The letter also asked parents to keep this confidential, as it was still an ongoing investigation. Needless to say, that did not happen. As Johnson's claims increased in absurdity, many of those prosecuting remembered that she was schizophrenic and that she shouldn't have been taken seriously in the first place. Unfortunately, Chief Colmeyer's letter had caused multiple other accusations to be made against the school, and parents demanded a full-scale investigation. Giving under the pressure from these parents, Colmeyer handed much of the investigation to Key McFarlane. McFarlane was a consultant for the Children's Institute International, a group with the mission of identifying and helping missing children. This will have lasting consequences. Parents were encouraged to send their children to the CII, and Key McFarlane, who quote-unquote interviewed over 400 children in 2-hour sessions, employed those tactics I mentioned earlier of rewarding children for incriminating information and asking extremely leading questions until she got the answer she wanted. This happens in many trials revolving around those unjustly accused, the police's treatment of Jesse Miskelly of the West Memphis 3 during his interview being a good example. Another member of the CII, Dr. Astrid Heger, conducted medical examinations on 150 of the children, except she didn't actually physically examine most of them. Instead, she just looked at the child's medical history, stating that, quote, any conclusion should validate the child's history, end quote. She only found supposed evidence of abuse in only 6 of the children she actually physically examined, citing scarring on sensitive areas. However, later research showed that this same scarring wasn't at all uncommon in children with no history of abuse. On March 22, 1984, the McMartin 7 were indicted on 115 counts of child abuse, another 93 being added 2 months later, and even more after that. In total, it tallied up to 321 counts of child abuse against 48 children. In June of 1984, Peggy's bail was set at $1 million while Ray's was denied. However, during the preliminary hearings, the children's testimony remained weak and inconsistent, claiming abuse took place in everywhere from circus houses to cars to a non-existent secret room accessible by a tunnel, while searches of the homes of those being prosecuted didn't produce any incriminating evidence at all. Also, for whatever it's worth, about 50 McMartin parents began digging for the supposed tunnels beneath the McMartin preschool and never found any. The McMartin's defense team cross-examined a multitude of witnesses, including parents, children, therapists, and medical experts, the primary question being, how could such large-scale abuse take place over such a long time? Key McFarlane was more than happy to answer, and stated that children were simply suffering denial syndrome. What? Or feared that they or their families' lives would be in danger if they said anything. Around now, many members of the prosecution lost their confidence in the case, which led to all charges being dropped against all of the McMartin 7, except the mother and son of Peggy and Ray Bucky. A few months later, Judy Johnson died of alcohol poisoning without having a chance to testify at the trial. Before the first trial even began, an independent film crew making a documentary of the McMartin trials gave the defense tapes of an interview with prosecutor Glenn Stevens, who stated that children had been embellishing their stories of abuse, that they had no business being in court, and that the prosecution had withheld exculpatory evidence, such as Johnson's mental illness, from the Attorney General's office as well as the McMartin's defense attorneys. Because of this, the McMartin's defense attorneys asked that the charges against Ray and Peggy be dismissed, but this was denied. The trial began in July of 1987, and other than there being less defendants and less charges, the first trial was very similar to the preliminary hearing, prosecutors arguing that the number of children who had claimed to have been abused was evidence enough, while Daniel Davis, Ray Bucky's attorney, used his same strategy of a, quote, common sense defense. 61 witnesses were brought to the stand during the first trial, 9 of which were children between the ages of 8 and 15. Many parents' testimonies were taken, most giving a similar story of having no suspicion of any abuse taking place until the investigation started, where they became certain that it had taken place. Parents would often suggest that bladder infections and nightmares had come as a result of the abuse suffered by the McMartins, some positing the theory that much of the abuse had taken place during nap time, a time parents were forbidden from picking up their children. The children had repeated their clearly absurd stories, telling tales of playing games like the, quote, naked movie star, a nude version of cowboys and Indians that often resulted in one team assaulting the other. Something important from around this time is that in December of 1988, Ray Bucky's bail was reduced to $1.5 million, and in February of 1989, Ray Bucky was released after being in jail for 5 years. During cross-examination, the defense eventually got to the tapes of the children's interviews, pointing out numerous contradictions between testimonies from interviews, the preliminary hearing, and the first trial, as well as Key McFarland's tactics of coaching the children into giving the information she wanted to hear. The most important witness during the whole trial, however, was Key McFarland, who spent 5 weeks on the stand defending how she interviewed the children, with the judge stating outside the trial and away from the jury that the more she testifies, the less credible she becomes to him. A professor of psychiatry from USC on the defense team explained that she gave the children a quote-unquote script to follow by telling them of the testimony of the other children. The medical evidence was also brought up here, as a medical examiner for the defense countered Dr. Heger, the doctor from CII's statements, saying that 9 of the 11 alleged victims appeared, quote, perfectly normal. The prosecution also brought to the stand confessed perjurer and Ray Bucky's cellmate, George Freeman, who made even more wild claims about Bucky, such as that he had admitted to having a relationship with his sister at a young age, shipping adult material to Denmark, and burying revealing pictures of him and a bunch of children in South Dakota. Another thing the prosecution did was try to prove that Ray held belief in pyramid power, the belief that pyramids have an effect on living things, to discredit Peggy's claim that she wouldn't hire unfit teachers, as well as to corroborate the testimony of one of the children that Ray took part in satanic rituals. I don't know how this corroborated that statement, but it supposedly did. They also tried to prove that Ray was attracted to children through his fascination with pyramids, and the fact that he didn't have any attraction to women, instead children. The prosecution was able to find a woman Bucky met at a pyramid convention who claimed that she had unsuccessfully attempted to seduce Bucky, though she later recanted, stating that she did sleep with Bucky and simply wanted to, quote, protect her reputation, end quote, as she had a family. This made the prosecution comedically angry, prosecutor Lyle Rubin stating that she was, quote, straight out of Central Casting, end quote, a casting group that specializes in body doubles, particularly for stunts. Eventually, the defendants took the stand, both denying all allegations against them. Ray's testimony took a long time, with Lyle Rubin asking hundreds of questions, many of which were entirely irrelevant, such as whether or not Bucky was in possession of many adult magazines, some of which had been confiscated from his house during the original investigation, and got him to, quote, admit to spending time without underwear on. Finally, after 30 months of testimony, the jury began discussion, something that ended up taking 2.5 months. 52 of the 65 charges, many of which were dropped throughout the trial, were dropped, which let Peggy off and left 13 against Ray, as the jury was unable to reach a unanimous consensus regarding them. Many child protection groups and parents of McMartin children pushed for a retrial, which was signed off on by the district attorney Ira Reiner. 2 new prosecutors were assigned to the case, and a new judge was also appointed, to which Judge Pounders, the judge of the former case, said, quote, I'm finally free after 3 years and 3 months. I was honestly afraid I couldn't live through it, end quote. I'm sure this means something, I'm just not sure what. The second trial was much shorter, and the prosecution presented its entire case in 11 days. Similar to the first trial, though, the jury remained deadlocked, and after a third trial was shot down, all the charges were dismissed. As I mentioned, this was the longest and most expensive trial in American history. It took $15 million, years of court time, and most importantly, almost everything from the McMartin family. Ray lost 5 years of his life in jail, while the family had to close their daycare center, with the building being demolished in 1991, less than a year after the conclusion of the second trial. But the case had an effect on a much larger scale, and many other daycare facilities were forced to close as well after insurance companies, afraid of lawsuits, increased their rates. Still, some good things did come out of this tragedy. Police forces did learn how to not handle allegations of this nature, while the Salem Witch Trials are one of the most infamous periods of American history, both for the absurdity of the claims made and the hypocritical ways of testing if someone really was a witch. However, when looking at it beside the much more recent Satanic Panic, it can be noticed that culture, and the effect that religion has on culture, never really changes. To understand the trials and why they happened, we have to understand a few things first. The colony at Salem, Massachusetts was settled in 1630 as a refuge for Puritans, who were often persecuted because when England split from the Catholic Church about 100 years prior, many English sought to exterminate the remnants of Catholicism left in the country. It should be noted that the Puritan religion is Protestant as well as English, however its criticisms of the Church at the time gave them the perception of being Catholic. All of that to say, the Massachusetts colony prioritized religion above most other things, so when claims of witchcraft began to circulate, they dealt with them quickly and effectively. Another thing we have to understand is the Puritan belief system, as it is important to know when looking at how the trials played out. Puritanism began in the mid-16th century, taking a lot of its theology from Calvinist ideologies such as beliefs in predestination and the authority of the Bible. The Puritans believed a culture of corruptness by denouncing many vices present in English society, such as gambling, drinking, and scantily clad women, as well as rejecting Anglican practice. This is largely where the perception of them as a Catholic denomination came from, despite the fact that they also opposed the Catholic Church. The number of Puritans grew throughout the late 1500s and early 1600s, however the numbers decreased after the English Civil War that ended in 1651, as the religion was closely identified with the war. Despite this, the number of Puritans remained as they were in British North America, with two major sects being noticeable, those being the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. The Presbyterians were largely based in Scotland and Ireland, and the later colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The Congregationalists are the ones that are important for this video, as they are the ones that were based in the Massachusetts colony. Both Presbyterian and Congregationalist practice were quite simple, based primarily on long sermons from a preacher educated in the faith. However, membership, especially in Congregationalism, was rather strict, as they only accepted, quote, visibly godly people, meaning that they were sober, faithful, and upstanding members of the community, and those applying for membership had to make a public testimony of what caused their conversion. Witchcraft, on the other hand, has been around at least in mention since biblical times. Exodus 22:18 of the New King James Version states that, quote, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live," end quote, and Saul, the first king of the Israelites, went to a witch to bring Samuel back from the dead. Avoiding getting into the implications of what that means when it comes to scripture, this serves as evidence that witchcraft has been both in existence and persecuted since biblical times. Furthermore, beliefs of witchcraft are present in almost all religions and are commonly associated with devil worship, hence why we're talking about it here. However, in the Christian sense, witchcraft and the persecution of it as a spiritual crime began in the 14th century and became most popular around the 15th through 17th centuries, in alignment with the massively popular book of the time, Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. This book, published in 1486 and written by German Catholic clergyman Heinrich Kramer and theologian Jacob Sprenger, detailed how to determine whether someone was a witch and how to punish them. The book argued that women were most likely to be witches, and claimed that witches could be identified by things like moles, referred to as witches' teats, or birthmarks. Methods for dealing with them included the standard things like hanging and burning at the stake, however also included brutal punishments like repeatedly dunking someone's head underwater until they died or confessed to being a witch. Around this time, a mass of witch trials began in England, which, as was to be expected, spread over to America through the minds of God-fearing Puritans, culminating with the infamous Salem Witch Trials. The final thing we need to understand is the society and culture of Salem at the time. Salem had existed for a while by the time the trials began, and it was composed of between 500 and 600 citizens. However, as most colonies were, it remained isolated from pretty much everywhere else, which led to a lot of infighting between the colonists. Petty land disputes and the like were a common occurrence in the local courts. Many of the families had been feuding for generations, and an already argumentative group became even more discontent when Samuel Parris became Salem Village's first ordained minister. Parris was known around the village for being very rigid and very greedy. Many Puritans would claim all the quarreling came from the devil, so the claims of witchcraft, something intrinsically tied with devil worship, make sense. The claims of witchcraft began in Salem Village, now the town of Danvers, with Parris's 9-year-old daughter Elizabeth Parris and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, who started, quote, having fits. These fits included some tame things, such as them screaming, throwing things, and seeing the apparitions of the witches cursing them. However, they also did things like vomit and contort into strange positions. William Griggs, the doctor called to Parris's household, diagnosed the children as under the influence of bewitchment, and, after being pressured by the people in the town, the two girls blamed the Parris's slave Tituba, a beggar named Sarah Good, and an elderly woman named Sarah Osborne. See that Hammer of Witches book coming in handy yet? Upon these accusations, all three were interrogated by local magistrates. Good and Osborne claimed innocence, however Tituba confessed, stating that, quote, the devil came to me and bid me serve him, end quote, going as far as to describe colorful animals and a, quote, tall man with white hair, end quote, and that there were many other witches with the intent of destroying the Puritans, who, I guess, did end up succeeding. Of course, this confession led to a panic throughout the city, and caused the wave of accusations that happened over the following months. These accusations included one of the most devout members of the Puritan Church, and Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter. These 4-year-olds really do need to stop practicing witchcraft, it's become an issue. Two of the most important characters in the Salem Witch Trials are the Mathers, Increase and his son Cotton. Increase and later his son would both study at Harvard and later work as a Puritan minister. Due to his high status in the Puritan Church, Increase would have to go back to England in 1688 after the Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter was revoked. When he returned in 1692, he also brought along another governor, Sir William Phips. At the time, there were many accused witches awaiting trial, and Phips established the court of Oyer and Terminer to rule on them. Bridget Bishop was the first ruled on and hanged in Salem town, the place where modern Salem rests, exactly 2 weeks after the court's founding. Shortly after the founding of the court, Cotton wrote a letter warning against the use of spectral evidence, or evidence came from dreams or visions that accusers had. This was the primary evidence used against accused witches, and it was very effective because it completely discredited any alibi the defendant could come up with. Cotton's view was shared by his father, who also encouraged that spectral evidence not be used, stating that it were, quote, better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person be condemned, end quote. A month later, 5 women were hanged on July 19th, prompting a sermon from Increase warning against judging others of their drawbacks and instead focusing on improving themselves, as well as clear implications to end the trials. Unfortunately, without any express orders, nothing really happened. On October 29, 1692, in response to the words of Increase and his wife being accused of witchcraft, Phips dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. This resulted in a new court, the Court of Judicature, to be instituted. This court did not allow spectral evidence, and only 3 of the 56 defendants were convicted, and in May 1693, all those imprisoned on charges of witchcraft were pardoned. However, this did nothing to undo the damage the mass hysteria and trials had caused, and at the end of it all, over 200 people had been accused, 30 were found guilty, 19 were hanged, 5 male and 14 female, and another was tortured to death. The missing 10 were let go after the pardon issued in May. As mentioned earlier, the first victim of the trials was Bridget Bishop, who was hanged on June 10, 1692, and following that, there were 3 other mass hangings, all said to have taken place on Proctor's Ledge, which now exists as a memorial to those executed in the trials. The first hanging, of Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and Sarah Wilds, took place on July 19, 1692, and resulted in the aforementioned speech given by Increase. The second hanging of Reverend George Burroughs, George Jacobs Sr., Martha Carrier, John Proctor, and John Willard took place a month later on August 19, 1692. The third and final hanging took place on September 22, 1692, and consisted of Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Mary and Alice Parker, Anne Pudetor, Wilmot Red, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell Sr. Martha Corey was a particularly interesting conviction because she was one of the most devout women in the colony, and her being convicted of witchcraft gave many the idea that if she could be a witch, anyone could be a witch. The final and probably most famous death in all this was that of Martha Corey's husband, Giles Corey. Giles was accused of witchcraft, however stood mute rather than submit to a confession of guilt or innocence. For this, Corey was pressed to death, an ordeal that consisted of him being stripped naked, having heavy boards laid on top of him, and boulders placed on the boards. Corey was given 3 different chances to confess, however only ever said, quote, "more weight," end quote. One particularly gruesome detail is that Corey's tongue is reported by witnesses to have repeatedly been pressed out of his mouth, only for the sheriff to push it back in with his cane. The pressing lasted 2 days, having started on the 17th and ended on the 19th of September. While reports vary, it's said that with his last words, Corey cursed the town, and ever since the position of sheriff has supposedly been subject to the curse of Giles Corey. All who hold it die or resign due to a heart issue, and the sheriff who placed the rocks on Corey, Sheriff Corwin, died of a heart attack 3 years later in 1696. Following the trials, many acted out some form of repentance, such as Judge Samuel Sewell, asking for forgiveness from the Boston Congregation of Puritans, and Ann Putnam Jr., a major accuser, publicly apologizing for her contribution to the trials. The trials have also influenced the way the court works, such as guaranteeing the right to representation in the court and the presumption of innocence. Another unsurprising side effect of the trials is that the popularity of witchcraft, both as something to partake in and as something to accuse someone of, decreased. However, the trials are an important moment in history long-term as well. Not only has it been the subject of many books, movies, and plays, Arthur Miller's The Crucible, The Blair Witch Project, or The Vivitch coming to mind, they also show a well-documented case of mass hysteria, allowing us to see how witch hunts start and end. The most interesting thing about the trials, however, is the parallels between them and the Satanic Panic. In the McMartin preschool trial we mentioned recently, a series of absurd claims were made against the teachers, stemming from religious fear, and in the Salem Witch Trials, a series of absurd claims were made against the people of Salem, stemming from religious fear. Furthermore, in both cases, these claims led to other people suffering out of fear that others were partaking in what the claims said they were. Finally, they both ended with none of the claims being true, and many people's lives being ruined or ended. This illustrates something fascinating about the human condition, that being that as much as we learn and think we've gotten smarter, our thought processes always remain the same, and we're always just as susceptible to peer pressure. Think of all the suffering that could have been avoided if people thought to consider what they were accusing others of, and tried to prove it with something truly concrete. And with that, we have completed the history, denominations, and public fear of the most misunderstood religion, Satanism. First YouTube video up. Got more on the way though, a few scripts already written. The next one should be the first part in a series that I'm hoping to cover, that I think y'all will find pretty interesting. But even if you don't, I've gotta say thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Later.